Hello, Hidden Gems. It's Lauren and Dr. John, co hosts
Hello.
and spouses, states apart, because I am in Boise, Idaho, and just attended Chad Daybell's sentencing. I also attended 2 months of his trial from jury selection to the guilty verdict to today and his sentencing. He received the death penalty for murdering JJ, Vallow, Tylee Ryan, and Tammy Daybell. Um, I used to end each of my lunch lives with "May justice be served," and today it was served. I don't know if it's necessarily something to smile about, as Colby Ryan said in his statement outside the courthouse today. You can't change the outcome of what happened, but it does feel like a way to begin healing and a closure of this chapter for many of the surviving victims. So it's been a nightmare, a 5-year nightmare for many, and this closes a major chapter. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing fine, I guess. I think endings like this are always a little bittersweet. On the
Yes.
one hand, you have justice, which we've all been waiting for a long time. On the other hand, you have another life that potentially is going to be taken. And no matter how heinous that situation was or how repugnant we think Chad Daybell is, and he's pretty bad, by the way, you still, to me it's always a little bittersweet that the death penalty is always difficult because you're ending another life potentially, and that's hard. I guess moments like this can be difficult for me because they really cause me to kind of reflect on the human condition a little bit, and just right, you not just the victims but the perpetrators and the murderers, the whole thing. And I think in moments like this I wonder if human beings can do better. Are we, is this what we are? Right, is this I that's part of my profession, but I think there's always an element here of sadness and loss all around, not just for the victims and their families and everyone affected by this, and for the community of which we're a part, but perpetrators are involved in that as well. And it always makes me question how we can do better as human beings and how we can prevent these situations in the future. Whether is violence intrinsically a part of our nature? Is that something we could ever expunge from who we are? I don't know. These are big questions that always come up in these types of moments, but I feel content that there was justice. I feel like the jury delivered a reasonable outcome based on the information they had, and they believe justice was served. And so I think that in this moment, I think that's really important.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for your kindness. I agree. I thank you, John. I spent lunch with, it was incredible, with the Douglas family, the Williams, the Ryans, Colby and Kelsey, um, and the Woodcocks. Families that never ever knew each other, right? Well, minus the Douglases and the Williams, but families that never necessarily, and the Ryans and the Woodcocks, but families that never thought they would all connect, and never certainly wanted to connect over this. But I will say it's been really touching to me to see how the surviving victims have reached across the aisle at one another, to break bread today. and Aunt Vicky as well, and her husband Jim. So it was it is it's a and I think they share the same sentiment, I guess, is what I'm trying to share.
Yeah, and obviously my heart goes out to all the victims. What you were there, but I watched the victim impact statements, and you and I have befriended some of the people giving those statements, and they're heartbreaking. They're always heartbreaking. But again, there's no victory because we can't bring the victims back. We can't, right? So I hope one of the themes obviously was that many of them felt like they weren't able to find some measure of peace, and maybe this outcome will allow them to begin the long journey of trying to find some peace, which is always difficult. So, but yeah, I don't, it's all very difficult. So, but I think it was a just outcome, and it brings, it brings to a close, at least for the moment, and probably not emotionally, but at least in terms of having a judicial outcome, it brings a long process to an end.
Yes. You have been watching all week. John watched the verdict come down. John watched, as you said, all of the victim impact statements, and you watched the sentencing. And we have questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Everyone wants to know. I sometimes John doesn't see my thumbnails because I make them, but this one is sentenced. Dr. John reacts, and I think you know that. But we all want to know. The Woodcock said they'd be watching tonight. Everyone's watching tonight, and we want to know what your thoughts are. I think the new chat.
Exactly. Let's start with the verdict, because we haven't talked about that yet. So, and again, the camera is not the best quality. So, I mean, I went back and watched I watched the video again in terms of how Chad was responding to what was being said and how he responded to the verdict. And I mean, it doesn't, in some ways, because it's not high definition, it's hard to really zero in on some of his nonverbals. But I do think that for the most part, he was pretty stoic when the verdict was read. And obviously he knew that the likely outcome of a guilty verdict could be the death penalty. So he knew the consequences of that. But I will say that towards the very, very end, when the last charge was read and there was a guilty finding, I do think that I detected a little bit of fear. I think there was a slight change in Chad's demeanor. I think there was a slight glimmer of fear and maybe even sadness. It looked like his eyes were tearing up a little bit. I mean, he didn't shed any tears, but to me, that was a really interesting moment, because I wondered if in that moment he believed that maybe he should have done something differently, or maybe he had maybe he had a moment of remorse or regret. And it didn't last very long. It was kind of a small window. And of course, then when they got into the death penalty and death penalty arguments, of course, that all disappeared quickly. And we'll talk about that too. But I think those moments, if I'm right about that, and I don't know, you were in the courtroom, so you could see it more clearly than I could, or Pryor could, because Pryor was right next to him. But it did feel like there was this fear, like, that he was afraid for his future, and there might have been a little bit of sadness, and I think those moments, again, like I said a minute ago, I think those moments make these situations bittersweet, in the sense that it's easy to dehumanize someone like Chad Daybell, or to see him as a monster, or and maybe all that's true. People can have their opinions on that, but he's a human being, and there's these moments of fear and sadness that make him human, and that's what makes this hard. How does a human being, and you and I have tried to answer this through our podcast, but how does a human being get to the point where they feel compelled to murder children and spouses and go on this killing spree, um and yet still retain potentially moments of their humanity? And so that's, to me, that's one of the bigger questions I always deal with. And I, we've talked about this a lot, but I think that moment, if I'm accurate about what I saw with Chad, and again, it didn't last very long, by the way. It was a really small window. That moment, I think, is what makes these situations so difficult, because I wonder in those moments, maybe if circumstances were different, or maybe if certain elements of his childhood are different, right? That perhaps we never would have had to go through this whole process, and perhaps people would still be alive. So maybe if he was more capable of experiencing that type of sadness or fear without being afraid of it, without anger, maybe we wouldn't be here. So I guess one of my messages tonight would be that, it's okay. It's okay to feel vulnerable. It's okay to have fear. It's okay to have sadness. That's what makes us human. And sometimes when we avoid those things, it can take us to dark places. So your mic is off.
Yeah, thank you. And I want you to know, it looks like Colby is also here today.
Okay.
I know you.
Hey, Colby. Thank you for your statement. It was quite moving.
It was. Thank you. We wish you the best, you and your family.
Yeah.
Well, beyond the fear, and thank you everyone for your kindness tonight. Beyond the fear, what else did you see, John? Well, or should we start with the sentencing, or where do you want to start?
So that's really, so the verdict, when the verdict came down, he was pretty stoic. There wasn't a lot of motion, except for maybe that 1 minute window, maybe, where it did seem like there was a little bit of fear. It did seem like he was tearing up a little bit. Other than that, he's been pretty emotionless and pretty unrepentant. And I'll talk about it in a minute, how that's a problem in terms of, I think, and we'll talk about this more later, but I think that if Chad Daybell wanted to save his life, the best way he could have done that is to have said something, and to have shown some remorse, and to take responsibility, right? Because the theme that Pryor and Chad Daybell keep coming up with is, it's not Chad's fault. He didn't do anything wrong, right? They're blaming Lori for everything. And that's not, when you're fighting for your life, that's not a good look. That's not a good strategy. It always amazes me that human beings in these situations would rather take the death penalty than express remorse and show some vulnerability and take responsibility. It's incredible. I've done evaluations with sex offenders and violent offenders for many years. And one of the things, towards the end of every evaluation, one of the questions I have to ask them is, are you open to treatment? Are you open to therapy for what you've done? And, this includes a lot of offenders that admit no responsibility for anything, but I still ask them that. Even though you're denying that you committed this crime, would you be open to therapy? And that's an important question, by the way, because the offenders that are open to therapy are much more likely to get probation if that's an option. So I've had offenders, felons, many who I've evaluated, and I ask them that question, and they say no, absolutely not. I will not go to treatment. And I'll say to them, look, you're a first-time offender. More than likely, if you were open to treatment and you were willing to kind of look at what you did here and own up to it, you could get probation. You could be released into the community. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard from felons who have said, I promise you this is true, felons who have said, I would rather spend a decade in prison than go into therapy and have to talk about my emotions or talk about my crimes. And I mean, and I'll ask them again, like, okay, let me clarify what you're saying here, because this is going to be in the report, that you refuse treatment no matter what, right? And they'll say, yep, that's true. I will not go into treatment. And so I think you have a version of that. You have a version of that here, that you have a life and death situation, and Chad Daybell essentially has to, put down his pride and his ego, for a little bit, and stand before the jury and say, I messed up, right? I take responsibility. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for all the destruction I caused. But he can't do it, right? He's incapable of it. And so it's amazing. It continually astonishes me that people would rather cling to their egos and their narcissism rather than, just face up to what they've done or confront their emotions in some realistic manner.
That is interesting. Yeah, if you just said, I'm sorry, this is the man that didn't take a plea deal. And plea deals are always an option when somebody, for the most part, has a death penalty on the table.
Yeah, and you and I know, right, exactly. You and I know that I'm sure that at some point over the past few years, I would guess that the prosecution, I mean, we don't know details. We've heard a few things, but that the prosecution probably went to Chad and offered him some deals. And more than likely the deal would have been life in prison without the possibility of parole and no death penalty, right? And that would have saved everyone a lot of time and energy. And he continually refused that. So I'm sure. And now we see why. Because this is the guy who can't stand up and express remorse or take responsibility for his crimes. So, he's obstinate until the bitter end. He's obstinate. And it's amazing how people like Chad Daybell, and I could generalize this to felons, but people that have, let's say, narcissistic qualities or maybe even psychopathic qualities. I'm not saying he's either of those. I'm just saying qualities here. How they just leave this utter trail of destruction behind them, and they don't care. And they don't care, and they leave this trail of destruction and tears and upend lives, as we heard from the victim impact statements. And there's just this utter indifference because they're so wrapped up in their own egos, or they're wrapped up in being right all the time. So here you have another instance of that the trauma and the destruction people like this are willing to inflict is unimaginable. And it psychopaths in general, I'm not talking about Chad Daybell here, but psychopaths have an enormously negative impact on their communities, way more than the typical person in a community. And it's sad, and it's just unimaginable.
I heard what you did there.
what, what did I do?
Well, you said the word psychopath.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that.
But
Robin B.
I didn't say Chad Daybell was necessarily one, but yes.
I know, but you didn't say he wasn't.
I can neither confirm nor deny that Chad Daybell is a psychopath.
Robin B, thank you so much for your kindness. She's been listening to us since our dining room table where we started our podcast in 2020, wondering where missing children were. Thank you. I have to go forward with what you just said. This is a man who didn't show any emotion during the victim impact statements. Now, I realize that he's the perpetrator, the defendant, not a victim. These are people that he knew that were part of his family for 30 years crying. And they're crying about missing Tammy. They're not even yelling at him because the victim impact statements, if you notice, actually didn't mention Chad Daybell. They actually only talked about their loss because that's all they could. And I don't know if people notice that, but all these victim impact statements could do is talk about their loss and how it has affected them to lose JJ or Tylee or Tammy. But let's specifically talk about the ones about Tammy, because Tammy was Chad Daybell's family, his wife for 30 years, who he once called his one and only. And these people weeping over Tammy were his brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws and his father-in-law. And they were crying and they were in pain, and he didn't flinch. The entire gallery, strangers were crying. Some Hidden Gems wrote us and said they had to pull over while listening in the car because they were crying over the loss of 3 people that they never knew. And Chad Daybell just sat there. What is that?
Well, again, this goes back to what I was just talking about. That I think you had this moment of vulnerability after the verdict was read, but that window closed quickly. That this is someone who, for the most part, is unemotional. He's defiant. And we'll talk about that more later. He's got some antisocial qualities. He tends to be a bit narcissistic. There's remember we talked about there's this taunting element too. There's this hostility. Remember when during closing arguments, I talked about how he was making these gestures that were completely inappropriate to the moment?
Yes. Yeah. His poker face was gone and he was shaking his head and nodding. Yes.
I said he was doing like he did like the fist pump when Pryor had one of his big supposed epiphanal moments and said that Chad was the target of the so-called paint gun incident and not Tammy, right? That was supposed to be a game-changing moment for Pryor. Chad basically did, Chad was all over that. Chad's nonverbals were completely different than they'd been all trial. In fact, he didn't do a fist pump, but I mean, he did a version of that. He nodded his head and, it was not the kind of behavior you'd expect from a defendant in a criminal trial fighting for his life. I mean, to show that kind of behavior to the jury in this circumstance is a very hostile act, in the sense that he's thumbing his nose at the prosecution. He's mocking the prosecution and saying essentially, see, I gotcha. Mm-hmm. I'm right. And I mean, so we saw that. So, but that is consistent with everything we've talked about, the hostility, like he's literally, and Pryor did it the other day. Pryor went back and literally taunted the jury.
Mm-hmm.
Pryor essentially said to the jury, when fighting for Chad Daybell's life, Pryor essentially said to the jury, I know you've already made your decision. Think about that. Who says that? Like, I know you made your decision, but now I'm going to show you. Now I'm going to remind you of how wrong you were in your decision. And I'm going to give you the same wrong, stupid arguments to convince you. I didn't convince you the first time, but we're going to go revisit the fact that Chad was a victim.
Yes.
Right? We're going to go revisit the fact that, to use his language, that Lori Vallow was a bomb that brought chaos into his life. We're going to go revisit the fact that Lori caused all of this destruction. It was all Lori's fault. So, he's taunting the jury. You think the jury probably already doesn't like this guy because he comes across as abrasive and he comes across as smug and arrogant. Like, you don't want your attorney to be the way John Pryor is. I mean, and in fairness to Pryor, he tried. Like, he's a one-man band. He didn't have the resources of the state. I mean, he did what he could.
Yeah.
And he tried. He had these humble moments where he'd throw in, like, the thing about when his mic wasn't working. He talked about, I don't even know how to use electronics, right? Like, but I mean, those moments.
Neither does the cozy coat.
I always dreamt of being a fisherman, right? With a 30-inch waist. Like, no, stop it. Like, you're not helping, right? Like, if you're going to bring in humor, don't bring in that humor. It's not working.
Well, in that sense, it was kind of like, so did Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell also had these strange fantasies, about, some midlife crisis and the perfect woman. And I don't know. Yeah, it was a little too reminiscent of the guy who was defending.
So you have Pryor taunting the jury, basically saying, look, I know you made your decision. And also when he says it, he's being like condescending. Oh, I know you've made your decision. He's rolling his eyes. I mean, how does he think a jury's going to respond to that?
Right.
I know you've made your decision, but hey, I'm here to correct you again. Even though I'm making the same argument I made the other day that you just rejected, but let's try again because I'm right and my ego won't to let me, put this away. And I gotta force this on you again. I've got no boundaries. So I'm gonna push this false narrative on you again until you accept it. That's narcissism.
Yeah. Right.
Just let it go, dude. Your guy got convicted on every count. And they came back in less than 2 hours. Like, put it away, dude. Like, it's too late. If you want to save your client's life, don't taunt the jury. Right? Like, I mean, come on, man. I don't, maybe they don't teach that in law school, obviously, but I was blown away by that. This is a guy who, like his client, and Chad Daybell was taunting the jury too, to some degree. And we'll talk about the ending of this whole thing in a minute. But holy cow! I mean, maybe client and defense attorney were similar, right? Like,
yeah.
Maybe they were too alike. Maybe that's why there was no plea deal, because these two were so, in many ways, these two were so similar. And I'm not calling Pryor a murderer, by the way, but I'm just talking about worldview here, that they couldn't take a deal because they really thought that their defense was a winning strategy. In spite of,
you think Pryor did too, or do you think Pryor did too, or you think he was helping his client the best of his ability? If his client refused to take a deal,
I think it goes beyond that. If I had to guess, because Pryor, the other was another telling moment during this trial where Pryor talked about, I forget the context now, but he was talking about fame, and he made a comment like, I forget, maybe you remember, he made a comment like something about fame came up, and he said, I don't need any more fame. I've got enough of that.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting moment. You told me that moment. Was that a Freudian slip?
I mean, no, it's more than that. It's like he's telling us, okay, so you weren't doing this for money. you were apparently, I think what he's saying is that was part of it. He's doing this for ego, no doubt. Part of it's ego. And so, yeah, it's true. It's possible Chad said, no deal, no deal. I'm never taking a deal. But I think, I don't know if that's accurate. I think Pryor thought he had a winning defense strategy, and that if Chad was acquitted, that he'd be the hero. He'd be the next Johnny Cochran. He'd be always remembered for the guy who got the murderer that everyone hated acquitted.
He's no Johnny.
Well, he missed his Fitbit moment. He could have had an OJ line in there, but he missed it.
We all need to be doing this right now for Tammy. And by the way, this is a lot harder than taking a step. Her Fitbit steps. If that's what she was doing, which I have a hard time believing, this takes a lot more energy than taking a step.
Yeah, so if you're cheating on your Fitbit, you must acquit. That should have been his Johnny Cochran moment, I guess, but he missed it.
Yeah, right. My goodness, everyone, thank you for your everything today. And I've seen a lot of questions, and for those that have sent questions, I am seeing them, and I've started some of them. I don't want to interrupt you and what you want to share. Should I save the questions for the end?
I just want to share, for the people that didn't watch the victim impact statements. I don't want to read all of them. I mean, they were all quite moving, but I want to share a few moments because some of the lines were really exceptional.
Please. Thank you.
So Kay, obviously, Kay was great. Thank you, Kay. Kay, quote, "The pain is indescribable. The hole in my heart can never be filled." Yeah. Colby. So let me, before I read what a little Colby, a part of Colby's statement, I should point out the irony here, because Pryor, in his closing argument against why Chad should get the death penalty, Pryor used the term bomb, that Lori Vallow, quote, a bomb brought chaos into his life, into Chad's life. So here you have Pryor to Colby saying that Lori dropped a bomb into everyone's life, including Chad's. And then Colby said, quote, "I've lost everything I've ever known. It's like a nuclear bomb dropping." To me, that was really touching, especially after the prior bomb analogy. Like, no, Lori didn't drop a bomb. Like, if you want to know what a bomb dropped in someone's life looks like, look at Colby. That's a bomb being dropped in someone's life. That bomb was not dropped in Chad Daybell's life. So I think the contrast there, to me, because I remembered Pryor saying that the previous day, the contrast there was enormous, right? Like, don't start using analogies like dropping a bomb and changing Chad's life when it's not accurate, number one. And number two, the irony is, I also thought about Colby in the Netflix documentary, which is where I met Colby, and I appreciate, Colby's great, by the way. Colby's a great guy. I really am glad I had a chance to meet him. And we had a good talk during the filming of the Netflix documentary. But the irony too of that is that show, Sins of Her Mother, which is the Netflix documentary about the Daybell case, the basic argument that the Cox family makes in that documentary is that when Chad Daybell entered Lori's life, that Lori's life was upended, that Chad was the bomb that came into Lori's life that created chaos, not the other way around, right? And so think about that. So you've got here on the one hand, Chad is arguing that Lori ruined his life. And then on the other hand, Lori's not saying this, but her family is saying this. They're saying, and Colby included in the documentary, said that, well, when Chad came into Lori's life, he was that bomb. He was that thing that ruined her life essentially and set her on a different path. So you've got two different versions of the same situation. And I thought of that too. So I appreciate Colby sharing that analogy. I thought it was really powerful. Samantha, I thought Samantha was great. Everyone was really good, but I'm just going to point out a few things here that
Samantha, Tammy's sister.
Well, actually, let me mention Kelsey too.
Okay. Tammy's sister-in-law.
Yeah. I thought she had a beautiful sentence about how this has impacted her. I felt like this is how it's impacted many people. Quote, pain, fractured relationships, and unhealed wounds are all part of the aftermath. This is the legacy of anguish and sorrow that will haunt our family for generations. Wow. The legacy of anguish and sorrow that will haunt our family for generations. What a beautiful sentence. Right? That was really moving. So many moving moments. Samantha, quote, the lies, deception, and murder have ripped our family apart, and we do not feel peace. There is no peace for anybody. And I kind of feel that way myself. Like I don't know that's the difficulty and the complexity of cases like this. I don't know that peace is easily found by anybody, spectators, family, right? That's one of the challenges, I think, is how do you find peace in a situation like this? Michael Douglas, the incredible statement. He was very moving. Everybody was, but Michael was the last person to talk, and just the absolute devastation on his life. Quote, yeah. I've had my peace stolen. I am wounded, broken, sad, angry, disgusted, betrayed, and looking for answers on the constant pain of grief and loss. What an amazing sentence. I am wounded, broken, sad, angry, disgusted, betrayed, and looking for answers on the constant pain of grief and loss.
Wow.
So I don't, with statements like that, with all of these statements, I think, it's at that point and after closing arguments, and the closing arguments, by the way, were exceptional. The prosecution really put together a strong case, and the closing arguments, I think, really tied it all together. Lindsay Blake did a great job. They all did. I mean, they all worked as a team, but for them to craft closing arguments that were so well done was really amazing. Law enforcement did a great job. I give a shout out to law enforcement on this case. Amazing job. So many people did such incredible jobs. These victims' impact statements were incredible. Of course, Kay and Larry, really gave a voice to the voiceless. Kay and Larry really kept this alive for so long and invested so much. I can't thank them enough, for what they did and the difference they made. So those I just wanted to share some of those because I was quite moved by all of those statements.
I was too. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom except for on Chad Daybell.
Yeah. What about Pryor? I'm sure he was.
I don't know. Someone saw him maybe wipe a tear. And someone saw Judge Boyce and Ingrid Beatty, but not Chad.
Yeah, so let's get back to Chad. So after the death penalty, the sentencing is read, and clearly it wasn't good for him. He gets the death penalty, and Judge Boyce acts. He has to speak. He has to say one word, whether he's going to make a statement, and he says no. Pryor puts the mic over by Chad, and he says no. But interestingly enough, I think that moment was so fascinating because he says no in a voice that I think is almost quivering. It's shaky. It's not a particularly confident no. I mean, you might be saying I'm reading too much into a simple word, but he's not saying that with a lot of authority. I think that's a no that's filled with fear. I think he's angry. I think at that point he's just seething with anger. You can't. He's trying to control it, but I think there's a lot of fear there, and it seems like I think there's almost a surreal quality to him. I think there's a little bit of surprise for Chad. I think he felt like Pryor nailed his defense, and I really felt like he thought he was going to be acquitted. Yeah. So I think there is this element of shock and fear.
I agree. I saw emotion for the first time, and I saw fear, perhaps, or shock as well.
And oddly enough, I think that one word, if you go back and listen to the way he says no, he doesn't say it with any authority. Right? His voice is kind of cracking a little bit. It's interesting. I might be reading a lot into that. I probably am, but if you look at his nonverbals and the way he says that, I think you do see there's definitely some fear there, which goes back to my after the verdict was read, kind of that I think there's a moment of fear there too, understandably.
Yes.
So, I'd be remiss, by the way, if I'm talking about fear and Chad Daybell, I'd be remiss if I didn't quote Yoda from Star Wars. I love Yoda. So,
okay.
Yoda on fear. This is a famous line from Yoda. For those Star Wars fans, you're going to know this, but the context here is that Anakin Skywalker, who we all know later to be Darth Vader, expresses the fear of losing his mother. So that's an important point here. And Yoda says, quote, "Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Fear leads to hate. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering." And also, I just watched Dune Part 2. So I had seen Dune Part 1 previously, but the second part just came out. And one of the great lines from Dune and from the original book from the 70s is that fear is the mind killer. And so I think the reason I bring this up is because I love Yoda, but I want to acknowledge, I think for Chad Daybell, a lot of this has to do with fear, and seeing that fear pop up again during the trial, I think was interesting, because I think in many ways, if you consider how Chad Daybell gets in this predicament, it's not altogether different than Anakin Skywalker or Darth Vader fearing the loss of his mother. When he gets involved with Lori Daybell, there's this tremendous fear of rejection by Lori. And we saw that in the love text threads. There's this fear of losing her. There's this fear of keeping her invested. There's this fear of failure. There's this fear of uncertainty about the apocalypse and the second coming, right? There's this fear of the unknown. And you and I have talked about in our podcast, there's this fear of mortality. Chad Daybell is approaching midlife. He's worried about his legacy. He's writing these books. You have all this fear, I think, with Chad Daybell. And I think some of that plays some role in these crimes. I think that part of the reason these children get murdered is because Chad's afraid of Lori rejecting him, and he wants her to be completely invested in him. And one of the ways he can ensure that she is to ask her to do the unthinkable. If she's willing to assist in murdering her children, then he knows that she's all in with him. That's fear driven. Again, back to Dune. Fear is the mind killer. Back to Yoda. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And so we've seen a lot of hate here for no reason at all. Hate based upon a false belief system that has created all the suffering that we're now dealing with. Hate leads to suffering. We're all suffering. And even though this verdict is justice, I think there's still a lot of suffering. Your mic.
Yes. What else? I'm here to listen. These are all the things I've been wanting to know. I've been wanting to know what you've been thinking as much as everyone else here. They've been hearing from me every day for 2 months.
I think those were sort of my main talking points for tonight. So if you want to open it up to some questions, we can.
What about what happened at the end?
Oh, yeah, the end. Right. So yeah, what an amazing moment. So the sentencing's ending, and Chad Pryor reaches over to shake Chad's hand. Well, do you want to play it? Play it. Yeah, great.
Yeah, want me to play it? This is the very end. The very end. Oops, sorry guys. I thought I could make it bigger. And now it went back. I'll just leave it. We'll watch.
Criminal Rule 44.2, and that's the mandatory appointment of counsel for post-conviction review after imposition of the death penalty. That rule is also applicable in your case, and a copy of the rule itself is going to be provided to you in counsel to ensure that you're well aware of any post-conviction rights you may have. With that, then, the court is going to conclude the special sentencing proceeding. Is there anything further I need to take up from the state?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your abiding by the court's courtroom conduct order. We'll be in recess.
All right. Thank you all.
Want to say what you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll get there.
Okay.
Let's watch it. I think it's going to end here, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
people were walking out. Okay. Is he looking at the jury right there?
No, the jury's straight ahead. He turned
Okay.
from the jury.
So there you
Turned from
go.
the jury.
So let me preface this with that there are times when you and I talk about how sometimes there's little snippets or statements that people say that are so
Mhm.
important for capturing who they are. Sometimes there's these little moments of behavior that are so important for understanding someone's personality or who they are. And this is one of those moments. So it's a moment, by the way, that if you weren't paying attention, it could go by so quickly. But holy cow, when I saw that, I was stunned. And so what for those who are going to hear this and not see it, so what happens is Judge Boyce requests that everyone rise, and Chad Daybell starts pushing himself out of the chair, and then he falls back in his chair. And so essentially Chad Daybell refuses to stand up and acknowledge the court's formal directive to rise and respect the court, right? And to respect the process. Chad Daybell stays seated. And so the question you might ask is, why is this important? Because everything I just talked about Chad Daybell, about being defiant and hostile and fearful and oppositional, you see it here. You'll recall, Lauren, that early on in this trial, you were reaching for your phone and it looked like you weren't standing for a moment, right? And what happened? Your mic is off.
Yes, Judge Boyce was very, very upset and suggested that me and my neighbor that he also felt was not standing should not come back that day in court.
Right. So you apologized. You acknowledged it was a simple mistake. Like there was nothing deliberate that you were doing to disrespect the court.
Right.
But not here.
To those asking, he stood when they came in. He always stood. Chad Daybell always stood. Not this time.
He always stood. He
He
always stood.
John's been watching every day from home. He always stood.
Chad Daybell stood every single time until today. In the very last moment of the very last court session, Chad Daybell remained seated, which was, I can't even tell you the degree to which that is absolute disdain for this court and for this verdict and for this judge and for this jury. And if you want to know who Chad Daybell is, go back to that moment, because that is Chad Daybell. If I had to summarize Chad Daybell now with a couple of moments from the trial, they would be the texts where Chad says he wants to turn up the pain on the children. So that sadistic moment about let's turn up the pain and suffering on the kids. That number one. And number two, this moment. I mean, I guess you could argue that he's got nothing to lose. What's Judge Boyce going to do? Put him to death? Right? Like at this moment, he doesn't care. But it still shows who he is.
Yeah.
It shows the level of anger and disdain and hostility that Chad Daybell harbors and is willing to show. And he does it, by the way, he does it in an extremely passive-aggressive manner. So, you have some defendants who might absolutely lose their composure and attack the bench or something like that. But Chad Daybell's not that guy. So for all those people who say, well, he's so quiet and he's so reserved, and yeah, okay, maybe, but that doesn't mean he's not hostile. That doesn't mean he's not oppositional.
Yeah.
So to me, that's an extraordinary conclusion to this trial, because Chad Daybell is showing you who he is, why he committed these crimes, and what he's capable of. And he's also showing you how defiant he is, how unrepentant, how remorseless. Right? You're seeing the guy that's capable of killing a bunch of people. All he's doing is confirming the jury's decision. He's affirming that they made the right decision by doing this type of thing. And, not that he's going to have any chance on appeal, but, that's not going to help him.
Thank you. Okay, we have some questions.
Okay.
Well, let's start with some questions I received from one of your listeners, Katie. It's clear, so I'll start here and then I have some starred ones. It's clear based on his heinous acts that Chad has a lot of rage. How was he able to control it in court and not have any outbursts?
Well, until the very end, I think he thought he was going to win. So he controlled it well until closing arguments. And then during closing arguments, he was starting to betray himself with these particular nonverbals, where he was being more, demonstrative about his behavior.
Closing arguments did start to show it, which was interesting because there was no verdict yet, so you'd think he'd still be behaving a bit.
Yeah.
Does all rage equate to outbursts, though? Or?
No, I mean, this failing to stand up at the end is not it's passive aggressive. It's not an outburst. Chad Daybell's not someone who is going to physically attack someone. I don't think he is to some degree passive, but I think he's fundamentally passive and introverted, probably. But so it's unlikely that he would have a violent outburst. But it doesn't really matter. He's showing you the same level of hostility. He's just doing it in a different manner.
Yes. What will happen to Emma and the other kids now that their contact with Chad becomes limited and they can't communicate as much with him? There are a few questions about the kids, so maybe you can kind of sum it up with a few things about the children. Somebody else wanted to know what Garth and Emma might be feeling right now. And I guess another question would be that people have here are, will Chad Daybell's children be able to look at evidence or ever, come to some understanding?
I doubt it. I mean, maybe over a period of years they might be able to come to terms with it, but I just don't see any quick solution. And to go back to Michael Douglas's statement about looking for answers on the constant pain of grief and loss. I mean, I think they're grieving. I think they're dealing with the loss of their father and his future, and I'm sure they probably still believe him. They probably believe that he was the victim and the jury got it wrong. And I don't see them changing their opinion easily.
This isn't a question, but Faye Owen says, last night I went back and she watched Chris Watts being sentenced. and he showed more emotion than Chad did. Empty vessel, nothing. Anything you want to say to that? Because I know you and I have talked about
Yeah.
Chris Watts before, and so they're saying that even Chris Watts showed more emotion
Chris
than Chad
Chris
Daybell did.
Chris Watts is a little bit of an enigma because for the most part he was sort of a regular guy who when I say regular guy, I mean it's not obvious that Chris Watts is like a narcissist or a psychopath or kind of a personality disorder that you might associate it with a murderer. So I think Chris Watts is a peculiar situation in the sense that he clearly has more emotional intelligence than Chad Daybell. There's no doubt about it. And so yeah, of course, I would expect Chris Watts to have more emotion because he's more emotionally intelligent. Chris Watts is somebody we haven't talked about yet, but Chris Watts I think would be a fascinating case study because he it's not obvious that Chris Watts, he might be a personality disorder, but it's not obvious that he is. Whereas I think the likelihood of Chad Daybell being a personality disorder is much greater.
This goes along with the Daybell children question. Will the Daybell children ever reconcile with the Douglas family? That was another touching part about the victim impact statements, was how they spoke to the losses of their family members that they no longer have relationships with. And again, Chad showed no remorse for that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I hope they can find some way to reconcile, but I think the Daybell children will have to start moving away from the narrative that their father was framed by Lori. I think they're gonna start moving away from seeing their father as the victim and try to come to terms with the fact that their father murdered their mother.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it may be difficult to have any type of reconciliation, I think.
Yeah. This is a question many are asking, but how will Chad mentally handle being in prison and isolated from people 23 hours a day when he clearly needs praise from people or people to revere him? Or will he be better alone than in Gen Pop?
Well, if I don't know if I would make this argument, but I think someone could make an argument that one of the reasons that Chad wasn't concerned about the death penalty or actually a couple of the reasons he may not have been concerned about the death penalty were, number one, death penalty cases usually get stayed for years and years and years. So I think even those who get the death penalty, typically they may not be executed during their lifetimes. So I think Chad would know that, number one. And number two, when you get the death penalty, you're typically separated from the general population. And that could be to Chad's advantage in the sense that in the prison hierarchy, and this is something I've come to know quite well, by the way, in the prison hierarchy, harming children is not high. You're not going to be favored in prison when you do that. So in all likelihood, there would have been tremendous risk to his personal safety and the general population. So being on death row is actually something that might protect him. Your microphone.
This was a question from last night, and I saved it because I thought it was a great question. Does Chad still consider Lori as his goddess? Yes, I know Chad threw her under the bus, but does he still love her? Is he still in love with Lori?
I doubt it. He's probably angry at her and blames her for everything that happened to him. Even though she she clearly is smitten with him, it appears. So there's ironically, there's a huge divergence there, I'm guessing, but I don't know. We'll find out. I mean, maybe he's, I don't know, now that he's in this predicament and he doesn't have a lot of choices, maybe he'll find his way back to her. But I mean, what he
Can
did
they?
is
I don't know if they can even communicate because they're both felons.
yeah, that's true. I'm thinking in terms of, I'm trying to, yeah, I mean, they couldn't communicate during this period, during the interim period when they were going to trial, but it's possible maybe they can write letters after I don't know. That's a good question. Let's assume that they can communicate in written form after this. I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of return to their old beliefs a little bit and fantasize about the apocalypse and how they were right all along. And, I think they could return to that belief system. I think at the moment, though, Chad's probably pretty angry.
99 Pink Balloons asks, can someone turn into a psychopath at the age of 50? Is Chad now a serial killer? So they asked 2 questions.
Yeah. It would be very unusual for someone to turn into a psychopath at 50. I think I would have to argue that those qualities, those traits, those personality features would have been present to some degree prior to his age. So I would find the research would not be consistent with someone becoming a psychopath at 50. You'd have to say that those elements were latent. They were present and they were hidden. They were latent until a certain group of circumstances came together. And then that person could act out some of those traits or qualities. And I think that's something like that is more likely here. You and I have talked about how there might have been certain features of psychopathy prior to all this that you wouldn't see in a criminal record, you wouldn't see in some history of criminality, but they still could be there, and they could be latent and hidden and just waiting for the right set of circumstances to arise, which they did.
I have more questions about just the way he acted in court. Well, I'll get to those in a second. Dr. John, do you think that Chad will ever try to take control of how his life ends instead of submitting to the process? In other words,
yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think let's play with one scenario here. Let's say that Chad still believes strongly that he's a prophet. Let's say he believes his visions are true and they're going to come true. He now has a problem believing that, I think, because now the state has taken control of his fate.
mm-hmm.
And so that's it. I think right. I think it's possible that he might try to reassert control of his life so that he could stay with the prophet narrative, which he can't argue that he's a prophet if he's subjected to his current situation or right. So yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Yeah, he might take matters into his own hand and argue that he has to harm himself in some way in order to realize his prophecy and to bring in the second coming or something like that.
Does he still? This is a question for me. Do you think he still thinks he's prophetic? Do you still think that's his defense?
Prophetic or pathetic?
Prophetic.
Okay.
I want to say a prophet, but I don't know if I've ever heard him say he's a prophet. He seems like he's more even,
I thought you said pathetic. I thought you said pathetic, but
does he think he's a gifted visionary who should be up there on par with Christ?
I think he still believes that.
Really?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I think it, again, this gets back to the question we keep asking. Did he really believe this stuff? I think, yeah, I think he did believe some of it. And in spite of everything that's happened, I think he would still look. The jury felt that way because they came back and said he's still a risk. One of the aggravating factors was, do you think he's going to reoffend, essentially? And they said yes. And that, I mean, so the jury's kind of saying, yeah, he thinks he's still a prophet. If you let him out of here, he's going to continue to gather and kill zombies. And right, they felt that way. I don't think they're
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Rye Guy says, I thought Pryor came off as very condescending. If I was a juror, I would have felt talked down to.
I agree. So condescending. That's a great term. He came across as smug, arrogant, condescending, all of it, right? Yeah, I think it, I could make a strong argument that the entire defense backfired. And part of that is Pryor's attitude. And kind of these jokes that fell flat, the whole thing. I mean, I think that Pryor really, not only was he not reading the jury, but he wasn't reading the room, the judge, the whole thing. I mean, yes, I think the especially at the end when he taunted the jury with, yeah, I know you made your decision and you guys were all wrong and you guys are all idiots, but hey, let me tell you the exact same thing that you rejected yesterday, today. That's condescending. That's incredibly condescending. So yeah, did that backfire? Yeah, if I was a juror, I'd be like, could we, why didn't we get this over 4 weeks ago? You know?
Yeah.
Why are you making me listen to this guy?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Hillary Bethencourt says, Pryor was, in quotes, let's start with a little history lesson, end quote. Such a condescending start to his lecture for the jury, too, right? Like, let's start with a little history lesson. This is kind of the same thing.
Right. And the whole thing and the fisherman and the waistline, like that, he's trying to be like an everyman, but he's not an everyman. Like it just, the whole thing fell flat to me. And yeah, I do think in the defense, I do think it backfired. I will say this, he was a one-man band.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much evidence, so much, like, I mean, given his resources, I will give him credit. He tried. He had a lot of blind spots, but he tried. Given the fact that he's a one-man band with almost no help, he tried. I mean, I didn't think it was very effective, but he did his best.
We're wondering why Pryor or Chad's children did not argue to spare his life. Is this going to be a case of never-ending appeals? Yeah.
I think bringing his children up would have backfired.
Yeah, I agree.
I think his children the jury already were somewhat skeptical of his kids. I just don't, I think they knew it would have worked against Chad. But yeah, I thought the same thing for a moment. And then I thought, I don't know. I think the jury's already disenchanted with his kids. So why, to bring him back and plead for his life when essentially they're they're carrying their dad's water. They're kind of, lying for him. And I don't know. I don't think it would have been effective.
Yeah. Well, Shades of Gray is pulling a, well, this is my voice, not theirs. They're asking what defense you would have gone with, but I'm doing it as if I was, how I did it with my, brothers growing up. Well, if you were in Pryor's shoes, what would you do? Well, if you have all the answers, that is not how they're asking it. No, but that is a good question. If you had, how about let's do this. If Pryor had consulted with you, what would you have suggested to him?
I would have told, the first thing I would have told him is scale it back. Scale back your defense tremendously, like Archibald did for Lori. Archibald, by the way, to me was much more likable, but and less condescending, by the way. But scale it back and focus on a few points that you know you can land with the jury. And if you're going to develop a theory of the case, let's talk about it. Like if, and I'm not saying, I don't think I would consult with Pryor, by the way, but in theory, if I did, I'd say develop a theory of the case that's much more coherent and it's based on the evidence, and, you know, see if it fits. But to do that, you'd have to, his approach was totally scattershot. To do that, I think you'd have to really be focused on the most critical elements of the case and where the prosecution had weaknesses, and you'd have to be really disciplined. And even then, the bottom line is it's sort of like Lori. I think, you know, Pryor was dealt a bad hand to begin with. So I'm sure it was an uphill battle. But if I had to help him, I'd say, look, you're stretching here. You gotta reel this thing in. You gotta pull it back. You gotta limit it to a few elements that are really persuasive. And once we find those, let's build out a coherent theory of the case from there.
Is the reason the Daybell kids can't face the truth because with the truth comes shame?
Yeah, that's true. I think that part of this issue is that they're extremely guarded and defended because they don't want to deal. Well, shame. They don't want to deal with the shame. Yes, they don't want to deal with the shame of that, you know, one of their spouses killed another spouse. That's a profound that's a profound realization to have if you're a child, I think, and one that can really overthrow your view of the world.
Does Chad disassociate?
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't know enough about Chad to really make that determination. But I mean, you know, it's interesting. There's research showing that most murderers have some dissociative disorders, or they tend to dissociate. So it's possible. Yeah, sure. Somebody asked earlier about mitigating factors, by the way. Why weren't any mitigating factors brought in? I think the short answer is I don't know if there were any.
Yeah. Okay, we have a lot of questions. You guys, I'm trying to go so fast. Dr. John, without offering a diagnosis, they see elements of OCPD. What is OCPD?
Obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Okay. Which to me explains much of his behavior that was seen in court, in addition to any cluster B personality, because OCPD is cluster C, right? So they're saying that they see they're saying they see elements of cluster C, but are you seeing any cluster B personality? Thoughts?
Cluster B is the one we commonly talk. Cluster B would be histrionic personality disorder, borderline, antisocial. It's the one we usually talk about. Narcissistic personality disorder. It's cluster B is usually one we talk about and we associate with criminality. But yes, I don't know. I would, again, I don't know. I've said this before. I'd have to sit down with Chad and do extensive testing and really kind of do a deep dive into what I think is going on with him. So I can't really answer that without a lot more information. But I think it's interesting to note that I don't know if it would be obsessive compulsive personality disorder. It might be more obsessive compulsive elements. In other words, less personality, more behavior. That a lot of murderers do have elements of obsessive compulsive disorder, that may or may not be personality related. So I don't, so it's an interesting question. It could be personality related, but probably more. It used to be, we used to call it axis 1 and axis 2. We don't classify things in the DSM that, but back in the old days, it would be more, I think it'd be more OCD on axis 1 rather than axis 2.
All right. So I'm going to just read this one, but Barb is saying, thank you, Barb, for this. Chad saying, turn up the pain on the kids was one of the most alarming statements he made. Does this sadism come from eternal pain he suffered, perhaps in childhood? He appears to deal with anger and rage in contained ways.
There is not, as far as we know, there's no significant childhood abuse in Chad Daybell's life. Although we were probably the first, and as far as I can tell, we're one of the only people that have speculated on the fact that there seems to be some element of neglect in Chad Daybell's past. And so what I mean by that is I think Chad Daybell was a child who needed a lot of attention. He wanted a lot of attention. He wasn't getting that attention. He needed to feel special. He wanted to feel special. He didn't feel special. And so I think from Chad's perspective, he probably felt like he was neglected to some degree. Now, if I was interviewing Chad Daybell, would I classify that as neglect? I don't know. I mean, so there's a difference between neglect from his perspective versus, let's call it more of an objective perspective. What would his parents say? What would his brothers say? What would his family say? Did they feel neglected? Did they feel like there were conditions in the home where Chad was neglected? I don't know. I'd have to talk to those people and make that determination. But I think the closest thing with Chad that we can discern at this point is that there might have been some type of neglect from his point of view.
Did Chad think of himself as a higher being, and is that why he didn't take a plea deal? I guess it's sort of a combination of the questions you've been asked, but I guess a little bit more specific. You believe that he thinks he's gifted still, and you believe he is arrogant, but is being gifted the reason he didn't take a plea deal?
I think it's part of it. Part of not taking a plea deal must have been that he thought he could prevail, and thinking he could prevail has to be tied into some type of pride or maybe some type of narcissism. I mean, because when you look at the evidence and you look at what the prosecution has, I think it's most reasonable people would assume that you're not going to prevail, especially after Lori's trial, by the way. Looking at the outcome there, you'd have to think that the chances were fairly dismal, but he didn't. So, yeah. Does he believe he's still a prophet? I think he's struggling with it.
Yeah. I just had a question. Where to go? Do you think Chad would ever be capable of genuine remorse?
I have worked with some felons over the years. So one of the things I talk about is running offender groups. And I have had some felons in my groups for a decade. And when they first came in, they were extremely oppositional and defiant. And I had very little hope that they would change. But over time, they actually were able to develop some empathy and show remorse. And so it's possible. It all depends on Chad's willingness to change. If he has any, it seems like he doesn't have a lot of motivation to change, but if he did, it's possible he could develop some remorse. I wouldn't hold my breath, but he might.
Do you think that Chad Daybell told John Pryor the truth? I guess it also depends on what the truth is. I mean, what does Chad Daybell think the truth is? I guess that begs the question, what does Chad Daybell think the truth is? And did he tell John Pryor the truth?
Yeah, I don't think he told I don't know. I don't think he told Pryor the truth. I think he probably I don't know that I don't know. That's a tough question. I can't he probably gave Pryor his version of events. He probably denied most involvement. I don't know.
All right. Thank you, Candace. From the pant girl today, Candace was there and I told her I liked her pants. She had these adorable plaid pants on. So thank you. Candace is actually asking, and there's some words that I can't use. Do you think that Chad Daybell struggled with, you work with offenders, some S offenders, I'm using wording. And Candace is asking if you think he struggled with some sort of, those type of addictions or disorders that maybe S offenders do. I don't know how to use those words. Sorry, I'm doing my best for YouTube.
Maybe I think that could go hand in hand with if he had some OCD qualities, maybe some of that, or it could go hand in hand with his attitude towards women. I think for the most part, he saw women as inferior or objectified women. So I think that's part of it. If he did have those tendencies, then I think that would those elements would play a role in that.
If the theory was all of Lori's fault, why would they not have a psych witness for mitigation to testify to like Stockholm or some sort of coercion?
Because they know it wasn't all Lori's fault. So speaking of mitigation, so I've been involved in quite a few mitigation cases, by the way, and when it's on the defense side, it's almost always on the defense side. The defense they'll try to float with a theory of the case, or they'll try to get me, they'll kind of try to suggest what they think the mitigating factors are, but it's still up to me to make that determination. So,
right.
So in the end, there may or may not be mitigating factors. They have to bring in an expert to find those. But I think if you brought in someone if you argued that it's all Lori's fault, the person that would be evaluating Chad for mitigation would probably have a hard time believing that.
Let's see. I had all these great questions. Let's see. I can't even, well, someone's just saying this. I can't even imagine what Tammy suffered during their marriage. Can you talk about maybe why it couldn't, it wouldn't be noticed by the children, or how this could happen and have it not be noticed, or the subtle things that maybe could have been missed or even confused Tammy?
Well, I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be glaringly obvious the way he
Right.
mistreated her. I think it would be subtle, like giving her the silent treatment when he's upset with her, that type of thing, or avoiding her, ignoring her for days on end, maybe when he's angry with her, or triangulating. We know from his book, he talked about bringing in some of Tammy's family to help deal with a situation like her depression, or she was playing a game too much, and he didn't have the capacity to address it directly with her, so he brought in other members of the family to address it. Things like that, the lack of direct communication, the lack of open expression of feelings and thoughts, the maybe being critical of certain things a lot, and those moments can be normalized in a family. If a family's used to Chad, let's say it's Chad, to a parent being hypercritical of a spouse, then they don't know any better. They see that as normal. And so I don't know if Chad was super critical. I think he may have been a little bit, but even subtle criticism can take a toll. So I think there were a lot of those things going on, but they were none of them. I would guess were over the top, right? They weren't at the level of trying to, pushing her, slapping her, physical violence, restraining her, any of that. So it might have been confusing to the kids to see behaviors that in many ways would be considered abusive and coercive, but not to understand that.
Yeah, it would be very confusing. Dr. John, what do you think of Chad's social, emotional maturity? He seems emotionally stunted. you think?
Yeah.
Let's
There's
talk James and Elena texts. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Anybody who was with us for our analysis of the text thread would know how we feel about that. But yeah, I agree. There's definitely some there's a lack of emotional intelligence, and there does seem to be maybe some developmental arrest, and I'm not sure exactly where that would be, but he definitely seems to come off, to present at a much younger age than he is.
Heather asks, Dr. John, was Lori and Chad, were they always crazy, or did they go crazy? Did they always have this in them? We've done that's like a whole podcast season.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to move things along a little bit here. So, because
You have a friend.
yeah, he was on his headphones and now he's not on his headphones.
Oh,
So,
okay. Are you able to answer this one a bit? And I will. Yeah. This is the problem when your co-host is your spouse. We have to tag team parenting.
I don't think I think for the most part, people just don't go crazy overnight. I think usually there's some propensity towards craziness that exists, and there could be a special set of circumstances or a situation that brings it out. And so I think for both of them, there were probably some features of, to use Heather's term, there were some features of craziness that were present, and they just needed the right catalyst to kind of set the crazy free. So, I've always said that they sort of encouraged each other, and they played on each other's craziness, and that's what really lit the match here.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. All right. My goodness. Anything else? Well, yeah. If you need to go, babe, what do you want to say? I can let you conclude. And I'm sorry, everyone, that we can't get to all of your questions tonight. But thank you so much for so many of them. What else would you like to say before we go?
I think I was thinking about, and you and I will get together on Patreon and some other platforms and talk about more kind of our personal journey and our personal experiences on this case. I think we need a little time to digest it and reflect on it too, since since the verdict is so fresh, right? So I think we're not quite at the end of this process, but
No, we're not. We hope to also interview some of the law enforcement and hopefully prosecution as well. I can tell you.
I think there was a wrench thrown in. Can you
It's a real wrench or a pretend wrench?
No, there's
a wrench. Yeah. I hear you.
I'm trying to think what I can say and what I can't say under the circumstances, but
Yeah.
So there was a case in Australia that we talked about in our book club several months ago. It's the Robert Farquharson case. Many people in this country don't know about it, but it involved 3 children, and essentially their father drove them into a lake. And the big issue during the trial was, and the children none of the children survived. One of the children, Jai, was 10, Tyler 7, Bailey 2. And the big issue was, so Farquharson argued that it was an accident, that he had this seizure and he passed out and the car went off the road and went into the Farquharson, survived and climbed out of the car and went to safety. Never mind that Farquharson didn't seek any help for the children for a significant period of time after. In fact, not only did he not seek help, he went to see his wife to let her know what happened, almost as if he was punishing her because his wife had divorced him. And a big part of that case was that whether it was an accident or whether it was deliberate. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people didn't want to believe that a father could do that to his kids. And so I'm sure there was a lot of debate about his motives and what happened, and that was a big part of it. This woman, Helen Garner, she wrote a book that we read called This House of Grief. It's a fantastic book, and she talks about the trial, and she talks about the loss of the kids and how unimaginable it is. And I was thinking today, after this case was resolved or sentencing was resolved, about some of the parallels. And I there's a line in here that she wrote towards the end of the book that I think I want to read because it sums up so many of my feelings about this particular case. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that here. This is page 300 of the Helen Garner book. She says, when I let myself think of Jai, Tyler, and Bailey lying in their quiet cemetery, watched over by the golden emblems of Bob the Builder and the bombers, I imagine the possessive rage of their families. You never knew them. You never even saw them. How dare you talk about your grief? But no other words will do. No other word will do. Every stranger grieves for them. Every stranger's heart is broken. The children's fate is our legitimate concern. They are ours to mourn. They belong to all of us now. And I feel like in this case and in this tragedy, I feel like after this verdict, I feel like all these victims, they belong to us now. You know, as we mourn the loss of the children and the adults and all the victims. And I would go further, as we mourn the loss of all victims of crime and all children of crime and all children that we lose in general. And I think that this case, to me, it's a reminder of all our shared grief. And I hope that, you know, we've seen this in our community and it's been remarkable, but, you know, I really feel like in many ways we've kind of united as one in our shared grief. And maybe not as one, but we've been able to share our grief over this case. And I think now maybe with this verdict that we can really start coming to terms with that. And I feel like that should include all victims of crime, all children who are victims of crime. And maybe, you know, I started with the idea that sometimes I question our hope for humanity when I see cases like this. And, but maybe, just maybe, if we really mourn and grieve and understand the implications of these types of situations, maybe we can find some hope. Your mic.
Thank you. I can't wait to now fly home to see you so
Yeah,
that I can then sleep
we're-
for a month.
We're eagerly awaiting your arrival, believe me. I think the house, since even though you've only been gone a week now, I think the house is taking a turn for the worse.
I know everyone's like, you need to take a vacation. I'm like, I'm going to be taking a vacation to clean. I think.
You know things are bad when your son tells you. So our son told me the other day, he's like, Dad, I'm pretty good at making messes. And I'm like, I was like, yep, I agree. And I used to be good at cleaning them up, but you know, I just gave up at this point. So we're waiting for you to clean up some messes with us. I can't chase down any more messes at this point. I'm grieving too much. I am grieving, by the way. That this case has been hard, and you know, I'm glad that I hope in our own small way that we made a little difference somewhere here. But
I think we did. You certainly did, John. You've made a difference to me too. I want to say processing this tragedy for nearly, 5 years with you has made a world of difference for me. You always say that a better understanding of crime is a better understanding of ourselves. And I can honestly tell you that 4.5 years later, I know myself better. and I've changed for the better, and I've grown for the better, and I've thought more, and I'm more aware. And I want to thank you because I see the world in a little bit differently now. A little or a lot, I don't know. But I thank you for that because you've allowed me to talk about this case with you for so long. It's become a part of our family history now, in a way, talking about it, understanding it, learning about it, getting to know the surviving victims, and you allowing me to be at both trials every day because you took over at home. And so I want to say thank you to you too for all you've done for me and for our family.
Thank you. And I appreciate the hard work you put in and all your sacrifices too. So I know it hasn't been easy being up there. But as I said, you're going to have to help me chase down some messes here because I don't know.
You guys,
I don't know.
I was there
I don't
this
know
weekend.
that a lot of people should come in our house right now.
You know, it's bad when you have to like shoo away the, like I was like, okay, you can just like hire someone. I'm like, no, they wouldn't know what to do either.
Yeah.
I was there over Memorial Day, and John even said, he's like, hey, can you help me just try to clean I just clean our son's room. And I was like, yeah. And then I saw it and I thought, you know what? Just in a week. So I'm glad he's been playing hard. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. All right, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for your support and care. And we have more cases ahead of us that need our attention. So we're not going anywhere. There are some cases John and I already really care about and talking about. And Colette, where did it go? Hold on. I'm looking for. I've just lost a comment. I'm looking. Sorry,
Well,
I
you
lost a
posted
comment.
it, right?
It's going so fast. No, CC is saying book a maid service.
Oh, it's well beyond that.
Yeah.
It's well beyond that. No maid is going to walk into our house and go, okay, I can handle this.
Anyway, okay. Have a great night. I'll see you soon, babe. I love you.
All right. Yeah. Have a safe trip back. Thanks for everything you've done up there.
Yes, we'll see you soon.
We'll see you home in
guys.
a little bit, hopefully.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.